We have now a session on health. I think it promises to be a very interesting session. We have 4 speakers, so without further ado, can I ask Yuya Kudo to do the first presentation?
Okay, shall I start? Okay, 15 minutes. So let me start. One legacy of the Civil War is interaction with health accumulation, and several pioneering studies have indeed shown that the armed conflict destroys their human health. And following these pioneering studies, one recent leading question is, in what ways the armed conflict destroys their human health? And this question is quite important to design effective assistance programs both during and after the conflict, as well as to better understand war's long-term influence on economic development. And accordingly, our emerging body of empirical research has only recently illuminated the significance of the several possible mechanisms. But among these possible mechanisms, malaria has historically been considered as one of the most important causes of the violence-induced mortality and morbidity. And armed conflict is expected to greatly increase the risk of malaria-related mortality for 2 reasons. The first, it increases the infection risk, because at the time of the war, people are often forced to hide in and walk through the malaria from bushes and forests while giving up taking typical risk preventive actions. And the second, despite this increased infection risk, appropriate treatment is often not available at the time of the war because of the impairment of the health system. But despite this well-recognized significance of malaria in war, few economic studies have assessed its influence in a rigorous manner, so I'd like to fill this knowledge gap in this paper. More precisely, I address this question, so does the armed conflict increase infant mortality by exposing pregnant mothers and the children to a high risk of malaria infection? And infant mortality is one reasonable outcome to look at in this context for 2 reasons. The first, infants are at a considerably high risk of contracting malaria. And the second, among the adults, one of the highest risk groups of malaria infection is pregnant women because of their weak immunity in pregnancy. And in the medical literature, it's well known that the maternal malaria infection is highly associated with their unfavorable birth outcomes, like low birth weight, and then low birth weight children are more likely to die soon. And then I address this question by focusing on the Liberian Civil War for 2 reasons. The first, Liberia is the ideal breeding ground for the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. So roughly speaking, in almost all the parts of this country and throughout the year, people have a high risk of contracting malaria. And a major plasmodium species in this country is P. falciparum, which is the most deadly health consequences among human malaria parasites. And the second reason is the brutality of the violence. And actually, Liberia experienced the 2 civil wars between 1989 and 2003. And because of the brutal violence, it's estimated that about 60% of the pre-war populations were either internally or externally displaced. In the literature, it said that in response to the sounds of gunfire or in response to the surprise attacks, people are often fed in and in marshes and swamps and in mountains for days and in weeks or even for months. So those people must have been exposed to the great infection risk. And also the violence is quite large scale and almost entirely devastated the country's health system by encouraging many professionals and actually the doctors and nurses to die or to flee to other countries. So this war may provide a promising setting for the purpose of this research. And the conceptual framework underlying the empirical analysis can schematically be summarized in this figure. So fightings take place, and the fightings increase the infection risk, particularly the pregnant mothers and the children. And then maternal malaria infection is highly associated with their unfavorable birth outcomes, like low birth rate, and low birth rate children are vulnerable to any diseases. And actually also ruined health system increases the risk of mortality, which is already raised by the increase in the malaria infection risk. So in the paper, I extensively reviewed the literature relevant to each of these stages, but because I don't have much time today, so let me skip those explanations. And then in the empirical analysis, I used the 2 rounds of the DHS data, and this is a nationally representative household survey in the areas of population, health, and nutrition. And women of reproductive age are the main target of this survey. And the DHS allows different units of analysis, respondent females or their families or children born to their DHS respondents. And then, but actually here I analyzed the data on the children born to the respondents. So DHS records the vast history of the respondents up to 20 pregnancy cases. So even though I just used 2 brands of the DHS data, birth year of the children analyzed in this study ranges from 1969 to 2013. But before discussing the identifications, I have to be clear about what I can identify with this data set. And first, as I said in introductions, at the time of the war, many people were displaced. And then, ideally, I would like to assess the significance of all the disease risk taken by war survivors throughout the years of the conflict. But I can't take this approach because it's quite difficult to trace their escape routes. So alternatively, I just estimate the war's influence on the children born to the mothers reside in the high endemic areas at the time of the war. And then this approach requires 2 assumptions. The first, compared to the pregnant mothers and the children hiding in or escaping from less malaria endemic areas, pregnant mothers and the children hiding in or escaping from high endemic areas might not be exposed to the great infection risk, which seems to be quite reasonable. And the second assumption is related to the impairment of the health system. And then whether the formal or informal, so infants might have suffered from the impairment of the health system at the time of the war, and then I assume that this problem might be more serious for the infants in the high endemic areas for 2 reasons. First, infants in high endemic areas are more likely to contract malaria, and the second, infants in high endemic areas are more likely to have low birth weight because of the mother's infection pregnancy, and then those low birth weight children are vulnerable to any diseases, including malaria. So I just jointly test all these assumptions and the health consequences, so I can just identify only the intent to treat effect of malaria infection risk that might have increased in the mother's original residential places at the time of the war. And then for child I conceived in a month S of year T by mother K in a community J, I just estimate this equation. So Y takes Y if the child died within Z months after the birth. So in the benchmark model, I analyze the 1-year mortality rate. And the double takes Y if the timing of conception belongs to the periods following the outbreak of the war. And then periods following the outbreak of the war can be broken down into 4 different periods. First war, ceasefire, short periods of ceasefire, and the second war and post-war periods. But in the benchmark model, I avoided this segregation. And M is a measure of malaria infection risk. I will explain in a minute. And X is a control, and then I also control for the community fixed effects and the fixed effects of the month of conception and the year of conception. Regarding the malaria infection risk, I used the index sourced from the Malaria Trust Project. So this index estimates the proportion of the infected population aged to 10 years old. And this is variable in 2010. And then I assigned the value of the raster points to each DHS community. Since this is a difference in difference, so first let me check the parallel trend. So this is a sketch of the data. And then here I'm splitting the data into 2 groups. Our children conceived by mothers in less endemic areas and the children conceived by the mothers in high endemic areas. And then here I'm reporting the 1-year mortality rate by the year of conception. So for example, about 27% of the children conceived in 1977 by mothers in the less endemic areas died within 1 year. So that's the way to see this figure. And then here are 4 findings. First, trend looks to be quite parallel, which is good for the identification. And the second, before the war, mortality rate in the high endemic area is lower than the mortality rate in the less endemic areas. But once war started, this difference disappeared. So this may suggest that the wartime increase in the infection risk might have increased the infant mortality rate. And the third, before the war, actually the mortality rate in the less endemic areas is higher than the mortality rate in the high endemic areas. This is quite reasonable if we take into account the significance of the mother's infection in pregnancy. So in the medical literature, it's quite known that if women grow up in the less endemic areas, they acquire the weak immunity. So once they get pregnant, their birth outcomes tend to be more serious. So the high mortality rate in the less endemic areas before the war may reflect the weak immunity acquired by women that grow up in such areas. And the final finding here is that whether endemic or less endemic, once the war started, mortality rate has declined. So this decline may be due to some selective omission of the childhood deaths from the DHS data. Some types of births and deaths are not recorded in the DHS. This omission arises for 2 reasons. The first, in the DHS, it's quite common that respondents failed to report unsuccessful pregnancy cases to the DHS team, like stillbirths, miscarriage, or deaths in early infancy. And the second, actually the DHS interviewed the war survivors. So if the violence increased the likelihood of such unsuccessful pregnancy cases, or if the war survivors were relatively in a good health condition at the time of the war, we would underestimate the mortality rate once the war started. But anyway, trend looks to be quite positive. Okay, great. Which seems to be good for the identification. And before showing the result, this figure may also be interesting. Here, I'm again splitting the data into the children conceived before the outbreak of the First War and the children conceived after the outbreak of the First War. And again, reporting the one-year mortality rate by the 10 different levels of malaria infection risk and endemicity. Two interesting findings here. First, whether before and after the war, the relationship between mortality rate and the infection rate is quite non-monotonic. This is quite reasonable, again, if we think about the significance of a mother's infection in pregnancy. In the high endemic areas, infection risk is really high, but if women grow up in such areas, they have a strong immunity, therefore mortality rate is quite low. But in the low endemic areas, so women acquire a weak immunity, but still infection risk itself is low. So that's why the mortality rate is also low. So basically the mortality rate is the highest in the intermediate level of malaria infection risk. So that's the first finding. And the second finding here is that at all the endemicity levels, once the war started, mortality rate has declined. So this decline corresponds to the decline shown in this figure. And then what I want to identify in the difference is that the decline in the mortality rate in the high endemic areas is smaller than the decline in the low endemic areas. In other words, wartime increase in the infection risk might have increased the mortality rate. And then this is a main result. First, I created a category called variables capturing the 10 different levels of malaria endemicity. And also I tried to control, I also tried up 50 percentiles of the malaria endemicity. So it's an indicator. I also tried a continuous measure of malaria infection risk. I control for the mother fixed effects and control for the time trend specific to communities. So basically the results are stable and positive. So wartime pregnancy in malaria endemic areas increased the infant mortality rate. So I will come back to the magnitude in the conclusion. And actually I tried a lot of robustness checks. I tried probability model and a hazard model, and I also tried to collect the alternative estimates of the malaria infection risk, but the results are stable. And also I tried to collect a bunch of geographic and climate conditions of the community, but the results are quite stable. And moreover, I also checked the heterogeneity of the impacts from many dimensions. One of those dimensions is battery intensity. So far, I haven't used any information about the battery intensity, but I collected the information of the battle events, and I checked that the mortality effects differs by this battery intensity. But anyway, let me wrap up the paper. So the paper is simple, and I found that the 1% increase in the war-induced 1% increase in the infection risk increased the one-year mortality rate by 0.44%. And although I didn't have time to explain this point, but actually I found that this mortality effect gradually increased after the childbirth and became statistically significant from 6 months after the birth. So this may reflect the significance of the maternal passive immunity. In other words, antibodies pass from mother to the fetus, which protects the newborns, but it tends to wane over 6 to 12 months among the humans. And I also found that the mortality effect is more evident for the infants conceived in the rainy seasons by young mothers residing in rural and battery-intensive areas. So all these pieces of information may help her in deciding the target groups for the aid programs at the time of the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuya. I thought that was a very interesting paper. So there's much to like about that paper. I think the research question is interesting, it's important. I think the paper does an excellent job of positioning itself in the literature by stating that the research question isn't just about the effect of civil war on child mortality, but on the causal mechanisms through which civil war affect child mortality. And that certainly makes it a much more ambitious research question, and one that's difficult to answer persuasively, but I think it also makes it more novel and more interesting. The data is carefully analyzed to the extent that it's very difficult to demonstrate in 20 minutes. The analysis is very careful. There's a long list, of dozens of robustness checks, a very long list of additional material in the appendix, and I think that's absolutely commendable. Yeah, so I think that's great. The paper raises many common issues that we observe in this kind of field about underreporting of child mortality and measurement error, and I think there's not much you can do about that, but it's good that you report that. The hypothesis sounds plausible to me, and I think I'm very close to being convinced, but certainly the most difficult part of the story is I think persuasively demonstrating that the effect that you find is necessarily only due to the effect of civil war on malaria incidents, right? And a lot of the paper is spent on that as it should be, but I think when I read that, most of the questions that I had were kind of with, you know, whether that is completely persuasive. So the problem, as far as in my opinion, really emanates from two data constraints. The first one is that you don't have any variable on time varying malaria infections, which is a big constraint. And then secondly, that you don't have any data on where mothers lived prior to giving birth in 2007 to 2013. So you know where they live now, but you don't know where they lived, which would have affected the mother's immunity, and you don't know where they lived when they gave birth, and that obviously makes it more problematic. So the data show that. Well, so I think there are a couple of things that's a little bit tricky. So the data shows that prior to the war, in high malaria areas, there was a lower mortality rate, and then it decreased, the child mortality rate decreased more rapidly in these initially high mortality but low malaria areas. And essentially that convergence during the war is interpreted as evidence of the effect that operates through malaria incidents. But I do wonder whether there aren't other channels through which that could operate. For example, one of the reasons you cite for this decrease in child mortality is due to several organizational initiatives to reduce child mortality over this period. If these initiatives were concentrated in the initially high mortality areas, which were the low malaria areas, then I wonder whether that wouldn't have produced the same convergence and the same regression results. I'm not sure how much you can do about this given the data constraints, but I have a couple of suggestions or a couple of questions. The first one, given how crucial the time trend is that you're interacting with the malaria endemicity, I wonder what happens if you replace the month and year dummies with an exhaustive set of time dummies. In other words, if you allow for a completely unrestricted time trend in the initially low malaria areas. The second question is what happens if you include a war dummy on its own instead of just interacted with the high and low malaria areas along with the restricted time effects. And then finally, if you replace the binary war variable with this battle incidence variable, not just in the subgroup analysis as you do in the robustness test, but in the main specification, I think it would be very interesting if you get the same results. I think that would be interesting to report. The other concern, I guess, is that although you control for many differences between high and low malaria areas, you don't interact any of these differences with time, right? And I guess that would be useful to see that the thing that was important for determining the change was the high versus low malaria areas rather than differences in the mothers across these areas. So just demonstrating that when you interact other things with the war variable, that they don't show up. I think that would have been useful. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. All the comments are helpful. So let me pick up some of the comments you made. The first one is that basically the impacts may be capturing the impacts of other factors. So I can't actually exclude that possibility here. But at least I control for the some are a bunch of geographic and climate contours, and also try to control. In the revised version, I actually control for the quadratic time trend specific to each community, but the effects are survived. So if those controls are capturing the influence of some other factors, they may still be capturing some influence of a lot of infection risk. And one other point I can to your point is that actually all these factors may not actually be mutually exclusive. So let's say the impacts of the maternal deprivation may also increase the mortality and morbidity attributed to the malaria infection. So in this case, the impacts could be seen as a sum total effect of this, all these forces. But I accept your view. And the measurement of malaria infection risk, that's a crucial point. So I can only have access to the information on the endemicity to the post-war levels. I see this point as basically the measurement errors, so including, so you said that this is a time invariance, so that's one point, but also I use this measure only coming from the post-conflict periods. So in this case, so basically this problem is a measurement issues. And then at least this estimate is global estimates are based on the malaria parasite surveys conducted in many countries in between 1985 and 2010, not limited in African countries. So this local experience of one country may not necessarily significantly affect the global estimates of this endemicity. That's the first point. But still, the malaria-relevant situation has substantially changed since the turn of the 21st century. But based on some published publications, or at least in the context of Liberia, there is no significant difference in endemicity between 2000 and 2010. So, but still, this is also the problem. I accept that. And decline in mortality rate could also be affected by the several organizational initiatives relevant to the health situation. So actually, again, I cannot exclude this possibility, but as long as I know from the literature, I didn't find big interventions that significantly change the relevant health relevant situation in the periods studied in this paper. And Actually, I didn't catch some of the points, but the subgroup analysis, so you are suggesting to use the information battery density in the main analysis? Yeah. Okay, yeah, except that so there are some pros and cons. Basically, another measurement issue is that basically the DHS contains the positional information on the respondents' present communities. So they may be resettling in some other places. So this may also contain some measurement noise. And then on one hand, so basically if resettlement, which may bias the estimates, is related to the battering intensity rather than the malaria endemicity, so just aggregating the impacts on the average impact of the whole country, maybe less suffer from that problem. But on the other hand, so your point is valid. So on the other hand, so if we really want to identify more precisely the impact on the world, so using the battery intensity in the main analysis may be actually helpful. There are some pros and cons. Thank you very much.
Okay, we now open the floor to questions from the audience.
Thank you. The question is why if the problem is the destruction of the growth centers, they need to apply heavily diseases, right? So it would be nice if you can, like, for example, if there are some area which have higher mortality rate caused by the diarrhea or any other diseases, and you're going to find similar patterns, or if you estimate how many percent of the infant mortality rate due to the war, then how many percent of this disease, how many percent of this increased mortality rate will be explained by the malaria, which can be more, I think, important and informative. Thank you.
Should we take 2 or 3 questions before we give the presenter an opportunity to respond? Other questions? Maybe you want to respond to that so long whilst people think of more questions.
Okay.
You want to respond?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the comment. So again, I see this problem is our interpretation of the estimates. So actually, it's quite difficult to make a distinction between the impacts of malaria and impacts of other problems. But as long as I learn from the literature, there are several neglected tropical diseases in this country, but I didn't find any impacts, any diseases whose impact is actually quite equivalent to the impacts of malaria in this country. So that's one point. The second point is that still the impacts are survived with the control of a bunch of geographic and climate controls, and also control for their community-specific time trends. In that case, still as long as the my major reflects the malaria infection risk, this impacts may reflect the impacts of malaria. And the third, as I said to the Rudolph, so actually these factors may not be mutually exclusive. So malaria infection may increase the mortality arising from those diseases. In that case, the impacts should be seen as a kind of a total effect. But thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay, so if there are no other questions, let's thank the presenter again for a very interesting presentation. And we now introduce the second presenter, Pauline Rossi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here on a Sunday morning. My name is Pauline Rossi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, and the paper I will present today is joint work with Denis Cognot from Paris School of Economics. So eventually we would like to call the paper The Impact of Malaria Control on Infant Mortality in Africa, but we are still working on nailing a causal link down. So we opted for a more conservative title. So the motivation for this paper is very simple. Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced a substantial reduction in child mortality in recent years, and this is considered as one of the big success story of the global fight against poverty. So the infant mortality rate decreased from 10% in 2000 down to around 6% today. And at the same time, an international initiative called Rollback Malaria started a series of large-scale interventions to eradicate the disease. So the most emblematic intervention is the distribution of insecticide-treated nets that I will call ITN for the rest of the talk. And this is very large scale. 900 million bed nets have been distributed according to the WHO. And it is estimated that approximately 2/3 of children sleep under a treated bed net today, against virtually zero before the campaign started. So these interventions are generally considered as a key success factor explaining the progress in child mortality. So for instance, here is a quote from the last report on the Millennium Development Goals, stating that substantial expansion of anti-malaria efforts have helped improve child survival rates. And so the goal of the paper is simply to challenge this assertion. So what we want to do is to assess whether malaria control efforts have really contributed to the reduction in infant mortality in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 15 years. And if they have, then how much and for whom? So the question is very simple, but answering it properly is tricky because we face two main empirical challenges. The first one is measuring the progress in malaria control in countries with weak public health systems and vital statistics. And the second one is identifying a causal relationship when the rollout of the program was not random. So we are doing our best to overcome these issues, and we don't have any real definitive answer so far, but we think it's still worth trying because this question is very relevant for policymakers. We're talking about high public expenditures here. For instance, in 2015, $1.5 billion have been spent on this in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's mostly funded by international aid. So it's important to know whether this yielded some return and how much and for whom. And in spite of the enthusiasm of international institutions, the efficiency of the program has been questioned. So some people have argued that the bed nets were not used properly or that the focus on ITN was misplaced because other interventions like spraying insecticides would be more cost effective. So the answer to the question is not obvious ex ante. So our paper relates both to the medical and the economics literature. In the medical literature, they are mainly interested in assessing the burden of malaria on child death. And this is not easy because you don't have national vital registration systems categorizing all deaths by cause. So they rely on verbal autopsy reports in which the caregiver is asked about the cause of the death. And so they have some data points and then they extrapolate to larger units like the continent. And that's how they estimate that, for instance, in 2008, 16% of under 5 deaths in Africa were caused by malaria. Then another strand of the medical literature tries to assess the impact of curative or preventive treatments against malaria on child deaths. So they rely here on RCTs and then some meta-analysis. So there is one paper reviewing the results of 5 medical RCTs in African countries, trying to estimate the impact of ITNs on child mortality, and the estimates range between minus 0.4 to minus 0.8 percentage points. So from the medical literature, we have fragmented local and short-run information, and any extrapolation then is based on strong assumptions that we usually, economists, are not willing to make. So what does the economic literature does? So the papers have been mostly interested in identifying the causal impact of malaria on socioeconomic outcomes like income or education, but not so much on mortality. And 3 papers have been published in 2010 that kind of set the golden rule for identification, which is to use eradication campaigns as a natural experiment and to exploit the variation in initial prevalence of malaria. So it's a diff in diff before and after the campaigns, comparing areas with a high prevalence of malaria where the campaigns made a big change, and areas with a low prevalence of malaria where the campaigns caused little change. So in this paper, we are interested in mortality, and what we do first is to estimate the correlation between malaria control efforts and infant mortality. And then we try to discuss the interpretation of the coefficient as a causal impact. So our strategy has 2 main strengths. In terms of external validity, we can make strong claims because we have nationally representative survey in 19 countries over the whole period of interest. And we have a large database with over 200,000 births, which give us the high statistical power that we need to examine relatively rare events like child deaths. But we face a main challenge in terms of identification because we cannot use the same strategy as the rest of the literature, that is the diff in diff exploiting the initial prevalence, because the parallel trend assumption does not hold in our context. And also we have no eradication. So we really need a measure of the treatment. And to get this measure, we face some data limitations that I will discuss now. So ideally, we would like to have some time series monitoring the evolution of the outcome, so infant and under 5 mortality rate, and the evolution of malaria control efforts, both in terms of outputs, like the malaria prevalence, and also in terms of inputs, like the coverage of the interventions. We'd like to have that at the finest geographical level for the period of interest and also the decade before to be able to look at pre-trends. So that's not what we have. What we have are the demographic and health surveys, providing retrospective information on all births, including date of birth, survival status, and date of death. And we have the GPS coordinates of the cluster. But we don't have information on malaria prevalence, and we have only limited information on bed nets, because we know if the household owns and uses a bed net at the time of the survey, but not since when. So we cannot infer which child was protected since he was born. So our first idea was to complement this data with the malaria atlas, which is a map constructed by epidemiologists providing the missing information, so yearly information on malaria prevalence and ITN use. But the disadvantage is that it comes from an epidemiological model that we don't really understand. It's kind of a black box for us, and some of the assumptions we don't agree with. So we chose to come up with an alternative way of measuring the progress in malaria control efforts. So our strategy is to exploit the spatial correlation in the distribution of bed nets. and to combine the different waves of DHS. So we are interested in the impact of the coverage of ITN in a cluster C at time t on the mortality of children born in that cluster at that time. We can control for a birth year fixed effect and a mother fixed effect because we have the whole birth history of a given mother, and some control variables specific to each birth. So alpha, our coefficient of interest, is a kind of intent to treat coefficient in the sense that it captures the impact of distributing bed nets in a village without caring for the actual use by the household. So the problem is that we observe this coverage in a cluster only at a very specific time, which is the time of the DHS wave. So to get information on the coverage at other times, we rely on other clusters in the neighborhood that were surveyed in other waves. So our assumption is that the distribution of bed nets was geographically clustered. So the distribution started in some area, reaches all the villages around, and then moved to another area. So we assume that there is a correlation rho between the coverage in a given cluster and the coverage in a neighboring cluster. And we can estimate this spatial equation, and we get an empirical correlation of 0.60. So then when we regress the child mortality on the coverage in the neighboring cluster, we get an estimate of alpha times rho. So that's what we have. We find a negative significant correlation between the variation in ITN access in the neighborhood and the variation in infant mortality for children born to the same mother. When we split the sample between non-educated and educated mothers, we find a stronger correlation for a non-educated woman, and it is actually only significant for them. So now, in terms of magnitude, what does this minus 0.02 mean? So remember that it's an estimate of alpha times rho, and rho is 0.6. So this implies that alpha is minus 0.033. So in other words, infant mortality is predicted to decrease by 3.3 percentage points when the coverage in bed nets move to null to universal. And in our sample over the period of interest, the coverage increased by 40 percentage points from 30% to 70%. So 40 times alpha corresponds to a decrease in infant mortality by 1.3 percentage points. Now, given that the mortality over the period of interest decreased from 10% to 6%, this 1.3 represents 1/3 of the decrease, of the total decrease, and 13% of the baseline mortality. So this is a very large magnitude, and also larger than the estimates from the medical literature. So now the question is, to which extent is this correlation really a causal impact? And here we think that there are two main threats. The first one is that maybe the correlation captures other improvements in maternal and child health. So the worry is that the bed nets are just one component of a broader public health policy, and it makes it difficult to separate out the causal impact of each component. And the second is that the correlation might capture different trends in infant mortality, and here the worry is that the distribution campaigns were not allocated randomly, and so maybe they targeted areas with a high population density or easy to access by road or a high malaria prevalence to start with. And so if this area have specific mortality trends, then the correlation captures both the impact and the pre-trends. So to start examining the first concern, we looked at the impact of neonatal mortality. And so here the idea was like when children die before the first months of life, they don't die so much from malaria, but more from birth complication and preterm deliveries, because the newborns are resistant to the disease for a few weeks. So if we find a correlation between the malaria control effort and the change in neonatal mortality, it would maybe mean that we capture other health improvements. It does not seem to be the case, but still we cannot rule out that there are other interventions affecting post-neonatal mortality, like immunization campaigns, for instance. Regarding pre-trends, we can test for them indirectly by doing a placebo on older cohorts, so children born way before rollback malaria started. And here we check if there is a correlation between the bednet coverage 10 years after birth and your probability to die before age 1. If there is a correlation, it would mean that the areas that received a lot of bed nets had different trends to start with. And again, we don't find empirical support for this concern. But okay, that's where we are now, and we are still considering other potential omitted factors. So if you have some ideas of other mechanisms and how to test them, I would be very interested in hearing your suggestions. So to conclude, what we have now is an estimate of a strong correlation between malaria control efforts and progress in child survival, and this correlation accounts for 1/3 of the total decrease in mortality in the past 15 years, and it's larger for more disadvantaged households. So one takeaway is that the correlation is also larger than the causal impact estimated by medical RCTs. So this might be driven by the fact that the correlation captures potentially an endogenous placement or a bunching of health interventions. We don't find empirical evidence for this, but so far. But the discrepancy might also be explained by the lack of external validity of medical RCTs that took place in areas where the infant mortality and the malaria prevalence were already low, and so not representative of the whole continent. So when we assess the impact of rollback malaria, there is a trade-off between internal and external validity, but based on the results we have so far, we make a fairly positive assessment of the intervention. Thank you.
Our thanks, Pauline. So this is a very important paper. So important for the child health, and also it's important because huge amount of money was spent on the malaria eradication. We need to know the correct impacts in a global sense. So in my understanding, as we are not requested to summarize a paper in this conference, so let me directly jump into my comments on this nice paper. And I have 3 sets of comments. And then my first set of comments is about the approach. First, to be honest, I was not fully 100% sure about the details of approach because sometimes T looks to be the surveyor, the T looks to be the Bassier, so it confused me a little bit, but this is anyway my understanding. So for child I born in ERT, so paper wants to estimate that Y is an indicator for mortality, and ITN is a community's ITN coverage at the birth ERT. But the paper cannot directly estimate this equation because the DHS contains the information on ITN coverage only for the surveyed years. And then paper wants to recover alpha by estimating 2 equations, and one of those equations is this one. So that paper estimates the spatial correlation of their ITN coverage, communities' ITN coverage across communities. But at first I was not fully sure this is a contemporaneous correlation across communities or temporary correlation across communities over the survey runs. But anyway, so that paper is basically assumed that this rho is constant, so time invariant. But as this paper exactly analyzes, so actually the malaria relevant situation has substantially changed. So I was not fully sure time variant rho is appropriate in this context. And relatedly, the malaria is an infectious disease. And then if, as this paper analyzes, so malaria control effort is really effective, and then this also disease externality might have made this spatial correlation across time variant. So I was not fully sure if assuming the time invariant rho is appropriate, particularly for the purpose of this research. So that's my first comment. And the second set of comment is selection issues. probably it would not be fair to challenge the paper in terms of identification because the tone of the paper is not so ambitious to identify the causal effects. But still, I would like to see some discussions on this topic. And the first selection concerns fertility. Basically, the ITN distribution might have also changed the fertility pattern, which might also have in turn affected the mortality rate. So mother fixed effects may be a good control, but I would also like to see the more direct evidence on the impacts of ITN distribution on the fertility themselves. So you can analyze this by using the DHS data. And the second point is related to my paper, so immunities. So actually, people in the high anemic areas have strong immunities. So this may make the impacts of the ITN distribution quite heterogeneous in terms of nonlinear heterogeneity. So that's the second point. And the final point is that the settlement issue. So in my understanding, so basically DHS contains the positional information on the respondents, only the present communities, which may be different from the birthplaces of the children analyzed in this paper. So at least I would like to see some discussion on this point. And also, if you can do this, so you might want to check if there are any change in the population characteristics changed as a result of the ITN distribution. You have multiple years of the DHS data, you may be able to check this. And my third set of comment is about the interpretation of the estimates. And then first, you are analyzing the neonatal mortality as a sort of a placebo test by assuming that the ITN distribution will not affect the neonatal mortality. But I don't think this argument is so convincing because mother's infections pregnancy is quite common and which is quite related to the miscarriages, stillbirths, and low birth weight. So this approach may not be so convincing. And actually, here a lot of factors going on. So other child-related intervention is one thing, and some other factors may be entomological, and some are environmental, some are biological, economic, and behavior, and also the mortality rate is outcome of the prevention and the treatment. So taking into account all these points, first, as long as you can argue that all these factors may not be mutually exclusive, so you might want to allow a bit wider interpretation of the estimates, or otherwise, at least you might want to control for the community-specific time trends, because you have multiple years of birth for the children, so you can analyze this point. So that's my final set of comments. Thanks. But this is a very nice paper.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all these comments. They are somehow related to where we are right now. So the first point on the correlation rho. So we are still we still don't know if we really need to make this structural assumption or not. Maybe. So of course we impose that it's fixed in time and all this structural assumption. Maybe in the end we will just say something like when the coverage in the neighborhood increases, then the impact on the mortality is this number. But we will probably not put so much structure on the equations anymore. The drawback is that we won't be able to make a very precise claim. But it's probably more correct, as you suggest. Then the selection into fertility, that's interesting. We also have a specification with cluster fixed effect instead of mother fixed effect, and we don't find so much difference in the magnitude of the estimates. So probably the selection into fertility is not so big, but it would be it's a good idea to look more directly at it. We can do that with the data. Migration, you're right. It's a big robustness test that we have not done yet because in the DHS, especially for these waves, the migration variable is not available anymore. So for many waves, you know if the people have been here for how long, but this variable is missing for more than 1/2 of our sample. So we are considering an alternative specification in which we would not follow mothers and using their retrospective birth history, but look more at a kind of panel of cluster, that we would put a lot of cluster in a bigger cluster and then look at the panel of cluster and restrict to children born in the past 2 or 3 years to be sure that they were born here. So this would complement our analysis, because with this specification we can not do much more about the migration. The neonatal placebo test, I also agree that it's not so convincing because of all the campaigns trying to prevent maternal malaria. So that's the first idea that we have, but I don't think we will continue so much with this. What we are doing right now is trying to look more directly at immunization coverage, because that's the other intervention that we are worried that when the bed nets were distributed, maybe they took the opportunity to vaccinate the children. So we can do exactly the same thing with vaccination coverage instead of bed net coverage, and try to control for it. So far we find a direct impact, of course, of the immunization coverage on the infant mortality, but it does not change our coefficient on ITN coverage. But we've just started with this specification, so I did not want to show it today. We will go rather in that direction. And the last one is to add cluster-specific time trends. And this also we started to do it, and to rely on the non-linearity of the trend in infant mortality. So far it seems to work, but again we did not make so much robustness tests, so I don't want to give a definitive result here. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience?
During first prenatal care visit in Africa, so can you use the DHS data to control for prenatal care, or even like?
I think, that's like with the immunization coverage, we could try to do a measure of prenatal care coverage and include it as a control to see if it changed. That's a good idea. In the end, I don't know if we will be able to say something very specific to bed nets, or more like the way rollback malaria was implemented, distributing bed nets and maybe all other things that were going on led to this decrease in mortality. So far we cannot say that it's the bed nets and not all the rest, but we can try to separate out some of the components. So prenatal care is everything that is measured in the DHS at the cluster level is possible. Thanks.
So two very quick questions. Firstly, I thought it was a really interesting paper. I was just wondering whether bringing in other data sources like the mixed data might give you more kind of coverage in terms of the way that you're using the kind of nearby clusters and so on. I don't know if that would help with the time and spatial aspect. And then the other one was just a thought about presenting the placebo tests, whether it's possible to present it in a way that makes it clear that it's not simply a power issue, that we're not seeing significance, but just a way that kind of conveys that there really isn't an effect.
And especially on the pre-trend, the coefficient is half as large as our main coefficient, which is smaller but not completely zero either. On this, maybe we'll have to do a bit of matching at some point to make sure that the pre-trends are much more parallel. But that's a good point. Yeah.
More questions?
Thank you. As for the projection to the result that your estimates are larger than the RCT, I think that's at least two factors. First is you are estimating ATT, while the RCT is estimating ATE. If there's a treatment heterogeneity, treatment effect heterogeneity. Second is maybe there are some externalities because in RCTs, then they cannot, implement a large scale. But in your settings, then it's kind of large scale interventions if it happens, and if my neighborhood has larger and greater acceptance of the ITN, then that might affect my infection risk. So that might capture.
Yes, that's also why we have the neighbor, because then we also So it's the impact of the distribution, but also all the externality that even if you don't use it, you might be protected because all your neighbors use it. So that's why we use the ITT.
Then you can, I think, decompose it.
We can what?
Decompose effect into the.
Yes, but then the problem with whether the household uses the bednet or not, that you add more endogeneity. Because it's a choice not to use it or not. So what we really want to know from the policy perspective is we go to a village, we give this bednet, and then what happens? Yeah, we could do it, but we think that we will be even further away from a causal link by looking at the treatment on the treated. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions. If there are no more questions, let me maybe ask something. So if I understand correctly, the point of the regression, the cluster regressions with the spatial correlation is to impute plausible values for the cluster-specific bednet coverage in cases where they're not observed, and to generate values and to use them in a regression. Was that accurate?
Sorry.
So the point with the spatial correlation regressions was to impute values that you don't observe.
Yes,
and I guess my question is, if you're using generated regressors, is it necessary to adjust the standard errors in the subsequent regression to reflect the additional sampling variation?
Yes, so we cluster the standard errors at the neighbors level.
Okay.
I don't know if to impute the fact that the row is estimated. And not, I think that's what I said. I think that in the end we will just look at the alpha times rho without trying to separate the two, because we can only separate the two if we do some strong structural assumptions. So I'm not sure we'll...
It may be worth just bootstrapping, seeing whether that changes the results, because that may have an effect. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Pauline, for a very interesting paper. Let's thank her again. Our third presenter is Kobus Burger, who will be presenting on the population health impact of the distribution of free antiretroviral medication in South Africa.
Nice. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be slightly braver and pretend to have causal results. Hopefully, I'll persuade you. I'm going to be looking at trying to estimate the causal impact of the rollout of ARVs on mortality in South Africa. I'm going to be doing this using information we have of where ARVs when they became available and where, and combining that with household information. First, some background and just pretty slides. So during the 1990s, we saw a big increase in the level of HIV prevalence in South Africa. Since then, it's stabilized more or less. There's a large difference in the level of HIV prevalence among different race groups. According to the South African National HIV Prevalence Incidence and Behavior Survey, Black African individuals on average have a 15% chance of having HIV/AIDS, while colored individuals have a 3% chance, and white and Indians have a smaller than 1% chance of having HIV/AIDS. There's also large variation among different age groups. As you can see from the figure below, the age group aged between 25 and 50 have a much larger likelihood of having HIV/AIDS than either the group younger or older than them. In our analysis, we're going to be focusing on Black African and mainly on this group aged between 25 and 50. So there's some famous papers. The most famous in South African audience, or at least from an economic point of view, is a widely cited paper by the Harvard School of Public Health, who blamed the Mbeki administration and the HIV denialists for not implementing ARVs quickly enough, and they used some fairly conservative back-of-envelope calculations to estimate how many lives were lost because the government was so slow to act on ARVs that were already available at that time. They calculate that more than 330,000 lives were lost because of this slow implementation, and in addition, 35,000 babies were born with HIV because they did not have access to nevirapine that was available at that time. Our analysis is going to be kind of the flip side of this. We're going to see once ARVs became available, how many lives were saved, or how did mortality decrease. So kind of the happy side of a sad story. So Pillay and Van Wyk show that they compare the trends, they compare the number of deaths over time. In the graph above, you see 2005, during the height of the epidemic, there was a lot of deaths in this young age group, aged between 25 and 50. And if you look at the graph below in 2012, we see a sharp decline, and most of that decline was the yellow part, which is HIV deaths. HAPS and others followed 12,000 households for 10 years, and they reported all the deaths. They had roughly 11,000 deaths that were reported, and they used verbal autopsy and physician reviews to determine whether it was HIV death or not. And they showed a sharp decline in the proportion of deaths that were reported to be due to HIV. Obviously, most of these results are not causal yet. That's why we're going to be trying to add to this large literature that shows a decrease as ARVs became available. And lastly, Zoe McLaren showed that, tried to see whether the rollout of ARVs, when they did become available, whether that was random. And she looks at the period between 2004 and 2006, and she finds that at least on a facility level, for that period, it looks as though there was no discrimination between rich and poor areas in who got it first. Okay, so we've got a slightly longer period that we can look at ARV rollouts, and so for the sake of our causal story, we wanted rollouts to be random, but it was pretty obvious from early on that it wasn't random. So I'm going to try and show that to you. So the period we are concerned with is from 2006 to 2008. That matches our household level data. And in 2006, you can see that some facilities were already delivering ARVs. These were mostly hospitals and mostly in metropolitan areas. By 2008, there was more hospitals, slightly more clinics, and some community health centers. So Zoe McLaren only looked at these two periods, and she found that within facilities, at least, it seemed to be random. But since then, we've seen that ARVs have moved away from hospitals and very much towards clinics. So if we go to 2014, we see the geographical distribution looks way different, and it's pretty obvious that it was first rolled out at metropolitan hospitals and then later at clinics, and there's no way that that could be random with regard to individuals. Since 2014 to 2016, there hasn't been a great change. Okay, now the data, we're going to be merging two data sets. The one has information on facilities. We have from Department of Health, and we've got the date that ARVs were first available at each of these facilities, and we've got the GIS coordinates of each of these facilities. And we try and match that up with NIDS data. NIDS is a National Income Dynamics Survey. It's got 4 waves, it's longitudinal, it follows roughly 28,000 individuals over 8 years, and goes and interviews them every 2 years. And important for us, there's a question on, did anyone in your household die the last 2 years? So at each period, we can look back 2 years and see if anyone died. We're going to be breaking that 2 years into 1 year, just because that makes our results more comparable, that we're working with annual results. Okay, also worth noting is NIDS does not have accurate information on HIV status, so we're going to be using, similar to the previous paper, intent to treat rather than an actual treatment in our causal interpretation. All right. some descriptors before we introduce the model. It's using the NIDS data. We can see from 2007 to 2008, if I look at only the African population, the reason I choose the African population is twofold. Firstly, 80% of the sample were African. The other race groups were too small to delve in deeply. And secondly, the African population had the highest HIV rate, so this is the group we care about the most. If we can split it up into the older, the middle, and the younger group, we can see all three of them have a decline, but the sharpest decline is for the middle group, which had the highest HIV prevalence. Similarly, on our right-hand side, we can see that during this period, we have data for the coverage in ARVs changed drastically. So it's worth noting the coverage here we define as how far you are away from the closest facility that has ARV medication. And depending on the threshold we pick, we can see it starts higher and ends higher, but for all three of those thresholds, there's been a drastic change in this key period that we're looking at. So we've got enough variation in our X variable and enough variation, it looks like, in our Y variable. Now we just have to persuade you of a causal impact. Just to check whether the mortality information in the NIDS was accurate, I compared it to the information we have from census and community surveys. So the census was in 2011, and there was a community survey in 2015 and in 2007. And I looked at only an African subsample, and I only look at natural deaths. So this exclude violence and accidents. And surprisingly, for a small household survey, the results fit pretty well to the national the national census and community survey information. So we're fairly confident in our mortality information in the NIDS data set. Okay, so the model I suggest. So first off, I had a simpler model, but it was pretty obvious that expansion of ARVs weren't random. So you could try and control for it by allowing for income or density, but later on, even if you think even if you're able to control for it on a facility level, you're unable to control for it on an individual level. So what I ended up doing is, within the NIDS, there's 40 clusters, and rather than comparing between these clusters, I follow these clusters over the 8 years and see how the change in ARV access affects the change in mortality within each of these clusters. Okay, so because of endogeneity concerns, we're going to be using cluster fixed effects. And in each case, your treatment is going to be whether within this last year, how big a proportion of a year did you have access to ARVs within a certain threshold. Okay, so we get to the results. The left-hand side is without fixed effects, the right-hand side is with fixed effects. If we just look at the younger population, age 15 to 25, we see no great difference when we add fixed effects. The probability of dying was 0.6 if you didn't have access to ARVs, and it drops to 0.2 if you do have access, so a large change in this group. The group we care most about, people aged 25 to 50, we see initially you had a 2.4 probability of dying. If you didn't have access to ARVs, the group that does have a 1.2 probability of dying, percentage probability of dying. That effect becomes bigger when we control for cluster fixed effects. Then we see that if you didn't have access, you had 2.7 probability of dying, and that drops down to 1 percentage point, so a 1.7 percentage point effect, which is roughly 60%. Then for our last group, people aged 50 and above, we see a much smaller effect. We see that if you didn't have access, your probability was 3.9%. If you did have access, it's 3.5. So in a way, we're hoping this can be regarded kind of as a placebo, because the HIV prevalence is much lower among these groups. So now more placebo-like robustness checks. Firstly, we make a racial comparison. So we make our group bigger, so make it from 15 to 50, because the non-black population is fairly small within NIDS, and we group all the non-black race groups together, and we compare the results to the black group, and we see that there's an insignificant effect for the people aged 15 to 50 among the non-black group. Okay, again, the HIV prevalence is much lower, so we were hoping for a smaller effect at least. Then we can also use self-reported health. We know there's a lot of concerns with this measure, but the idea is ARVs don't only save lives, but it also makes people healthier. And we again see a large effect. So on the left, we've got probability of dying and how it changes. On the right, we've got how it affects health. It's a similar magnitude effect. On the left, it was a 63% effect. On the right, it's a 69% effect. Then lastly, we also play around with threshold effects. So we've been using 10 kilometers throughout, but if we make it 5 kilometers or 15, we still get a sizable effect and fairly constant. And we can also use log distance, and I don't know how to interpret that coefficient, but it is significant. Okay, so now I do some subgroup comparisons just to see who we think gained most from the expansion of ARVs. We don't want to make the groups too small because we're working with a pretty limited sample size, but we can compare the wealth group. So among Africans, I split the groups into 3 wealth groups, and we see that the decline in mortality, both in percentage and in relative terms, were the highest for the poorest group and the smallest for the richest group. Okay, so it appears as though ARV access has helped poor people more than it has helped rich people, which is good if you care about inequality. Then interestingly, we try and see how the effect differs between urban and traditional areas. For the urban area, we see the effect was smaller, and for traditional areas it was larger. When we do add time fixed effects, we see that these effects die out for traditional areas and not for urban areas. You're welcome to ask me about that after the presentation, or right now. Just to conclude, we find a large 60% effect for the group we care about. We found hardly any effect for the group that's age 50 and above. We found no effect for the non-black sample. And we find similar results if we use health instead of actual deaths. And our results are larger than previous estimates in KwaZulu-Natal were for a similar group. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the paper. I really enjoyed reading it, in particular because it's very similar to what I try to do, the question and the methodology in another setting, of course. But so I was very interested in how you argue. So for me, the main contribution of this paper is that it answers a question that is very relevant for policymakers. So of course, HIV/AIDS is a burning public health issue, all the more so in South Africa, given not only the high levels of prevalence, but also the political context that has long been characterized by denial. And so that's why it's so important to estimate the population health impact of the free ARV therapy. And this is very well explained in the paper. So the question is not so much whether ARV work, because we already know from the medical literature that they do, but whether the free distribution of ARV would make a difference in the population. So I think here maybe you can refer to the distinction between efficacy, which is the treatment effect in ideal, fully controlled conditions, and effectiveness, which is the treatment effect in real life, including potential behavioral responses. And in the end, this is what matters for policymakers, and this is the parameter you're estimating here. And the second point is that you can make strong claims in terms of external validity because you have a representative sample of the whole country. And last, your setting opens the door to very interesting long-term follow-ups by looking at the likelihood of new infections, which is what matters for the ultimate goal of eradicating the disease. So in that sense, I thought it was very, very interesting setting. So of course, given all this, it's very important to get the right estimate. And here, the main challenge is that the rollout is probably not random. So I have just a few suggestions to strengthen the identification strategy. So in the version of the paper I read, at least, I think you can describe a bit more the determinants of the rollout. So far you talk about population density, wealth, and race. But I can imagine that maybe the initial HIV prevalence played a role if the medicine was first distributed to places with the highest needs. So maybe you can control for that. In the slides, you show some placebo and groups not affected by HIV. So this was not in the version I read, but it's good that you have it now. And maybe I've not seen any discussion on the pre-trends, neither in the slides. So this would be good to try to show that the areas that received the free therapy did not have to start with different pre-trends in adult mortality. My second point is about the measurement of the treatment variable, which is maybe not the most natural definition. So you use, instead of a dummy, you use the share over the past 24 months that the unit, during which the unit was treated. So a kind of intensity of the treatment, but not how strong, but how long. And I'm not really sure how to interpret this. So maybe as a robustness check, you can have the standard treatment dummy. So it's less precise, but anyhow, you don't have the exact starting date of the treatment. You have to infer it somehow from the data. So in the end, even if you don't have such a precise variable, it can be interesting to see if the results are the same. And if you really want to exploit the time dimension, it might be cleaner to use a survival model with a time-varying treatment dummy. And my last point is about discussing a bit more the magnitude of the coefficient. So how does it compare with respect to the baseline, with respect to medical trials, and with other large-scale public health interventions? So there is already something along those lines in the version I read, but I would emphasize it much more in the abstract, in the introduction, because for me it's really the main takeaway of your paper.
Thanks. Quick comment. Nice, thank you, and sorry for the two versions differing so much. Sorry, but these comments are all really helpful, and most of the things you mentioned are exactly the stuff that I'm struggling with and going through and back and forth with. So we don't have HIV data, but I'm just going to run through your list quickly. I don't have proper answers for anything, but we don't have HIV data in the NITS data, but we have played around with regional HIV information and try and group the areas that we know have high HIV prevalence and low ones. And it didn't seem to have an effect, but it could just be the measurement error on that, so we could get something better. The describing determinants of rollout is all the policy papers, at least from government side, are really proud about how random it is and that no one was advantaged and disadvantaged. And it appears that that's partly true, but I find evidence that highly dense areas and black areas were rolled out to first, which makes more sense than random for me. So if government was being better than random, the information, at least the data suggests government was being better than random while they pretend to have been random.
I think the one thing that's interesting about the is that there's a difference between thinking about from the user perspective and thinking about it from the facility perspective. And we want to do further analysis on that, because it's likely that from a facility perspective it was random, but because facilities are built closer to users, definitely it wouldn't be random from the perspective of a user. But most of those things one can are observable, and one can model those kind of patterns in terms of where facilities are located. We do need to do more analysis on that.
Well, so the alternative definitions of treatment, every time I've presented, people have asked me, why don't you use the strength of a treatment? So the easiest excuse is the data doesn't allow us to. So even we've got the amount of people that enroll into AOE treatment. So we do have almost a measure of something that was small and it became bigger, but we don't know the size of a population the hospital or clinic is serving. So it's tough to know if we see it at 100, is that 100 of 1,000 people, or is that 100 of 100 people, or 100 of 100,000? So I'm sure there must be a way around that, but that's currently what's preventing us from doing that. And I agree with we should compare it more to the current literature. I'm done. Sorry.
Thank you, Kobus. Other questions?
Yeah. One question is just, did you check that the impact differs between malaria endemic areas and less endemic areas? Because it looks that I'm keen on the malaria, but I see that the malaria is also the serious problem, at least in some parts of the South Africa, and actually HIV/AIDS reduces the people's immunity. So in that case, the impacts may differ between the malaria endemic areas and less endemic areas, and you may be able to do as one subgroup analysis.
I think malaria is much less of a concern in South Africa. We're below that threshold. I think TB would have been, it's much more, so HIV and TB goes hand in hand in South Africa. And it's tough to attack the one question without bringing the other question in. But we're trying to keep this streamlined, but yeah, it's very much, you can't, I get your point, you must look at other things that, even though you have HIV, it's something else that's killing you. And we're at the moment being agnostic about that.
Other questions?
Okay.
Anyone? Okay, there's a question.
Okay, so thanks, interesting presentation. Just a small sort of question or comment, because I'm just wondering about the randomness that you are mentioning. Because I would imagine that government would not sort of blindly roll out the ARVs to like rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods just like that. I think they would actually most likely target. So I think I would say the randomness maybe would apply to say, once we go to Mamelodi, anyone can access within the area. But to think that they would sort of almost simultaneously without actually any consideration, sort of just say, well, if it goes to Rondebosch, it's fine. If it goes to Kairija, it's fine. I wouldn't think that would be the case. So maybe the issue is maybe the way they characterize the randomness. It could be random within an area that is selected. But I would certainly believe that government would take a deliberate decision to.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think so. It's definitely random with respect to provinces and smaller areas, and I think government did well in that. I'm glad that it isn't random with respect to everything, because that wouldn't be optimal. So I think you're right. I think government were more considerate than they pretend to be when they were rolling it out, which is annoying if you want exogeneity.
Any more questions? Yep.
So I was sort of in one of your diagrams, Northern Cape. It seemed like sort of an outlier in a way in terms of the facilities that are dispensing. I don't know if there is an explanation for that.
I think it's tough interpreting those maps always, because Northern Cape is so isolated and the density is so low. So if you see 5 dots in Northern Cape, it might mean that every town already has something. It's tough from the map alone to know if Northern Cape got early or late treatment. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Kobus. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the last speaker. My name is Rudolf Berger, and I am presenting joint work with Zoe McLaren. The paper that I'm presenting is on a new econometric method for estimating population parameters from non-random samples, and we'll be applying this to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis data. So we all know from an introductory class in statistics that if you want to draw inferences about population parameters, you'd prefer to do so from a random sample. But quite often, that's not the data that we have. There are many cases in which the data that we have were generated from different mechanisms where the point wasn't to facilitate statistical analysis, but rather some other purpose. And the question is, what do we do in those instances? Is there anything interesting we can say about the population parameter? So I'm going to be describing a very specific but somewhat common purposive sampling mechanism, and then introducing a technique that we think can be used on such samples, and then we'll apply this technique to a very specific problem of estimating multi-drug resistant prevalence for the population of TB patients in South Africa, where the sample was drawn according to the model that I'll show you. The sample was drawn by only testing TB patients that were deemed to be at high risk of multi-drug resistance. The motivation is partly because we think the research question is interesting, but also because we think this kind of purposive or selected sampling mechanisms arise in several real-world situations. So the one that we're going to be looking at is the one in which doctors don't randomly test people for diseases that walk into their doors. They try to test individuals that they think are very likely to be positive and who need treatment in a resource-constrained environment. And similar samples occur if you think about traffic police who pull over erratic drivers and administer a breathalyzer, not randomly but based on what they observe how the driver drives. Tax authorities that select firms or individuals for tax audits based at least partly on the content of tax returns, the way that custom officials decide which packages, containers or travelers to investigate, and also to a somewhat lesser extent the way in which universities and firms decide which students to admit and which workers to hire based on the limited information that they have, but the objective of trying to find the best workers or the best students. So in all of these cases, what we call a sampling agent will be choosing observations with what they deem to be high expected values of some unobservable attribute of interest, and then they'll test these individuals and they'll reveal the true attribute, but only for the individuals who are selected in the sample. In all of these cases, it's conceivable that you can get an unbiased estimate of the population parameters, but in many cases, it's prohibitively expensive, either in terms of time or financial expenses, or just in terms of the invasiveness of the test to do so. And what you end up then is often a non-random sample of routinely collected data that was collected in this very selective way, and the question is, what can you do about that? Okay, so I'm going to be very explicit about the kind of sampling mechanism that we're interested in. So we assume that the analyst is interested in estimating the population mean of an attribute y, and we'll denote the population mean as mu. We assume that the sampling agent chooses which observations to sample, and they attempt to select high y observations, but they don't observe y when they make this decision. They only observe x, which is perhaps correlated with y. We'll denote the joint distribution of x and y as f of x and y. We define theta as the proportion of the population that's sampled, and we assume this is determined exogenously to the sampling agent. So in our application, the clinicians don't get to choose how many people, what proportion of patients that they want to test. People walk into their offices or into their clinics, and based on the resources that are made available by the national authorities, they can then choose which 10% or which 20% of patients to test, but they don't get to set that parameter, right? So clinicians jointly will observe X, which may be symptoms, it may be risk factors, it may be patient histories, and they then essentially rank patients from the highest risk to the lowest risk, and then they receive exogenously a sampling share, and they then choose to test the 10% or the 20% individuals that are deemed to be at highest risk. And these individuals are tested, and we learn what their Y is, but we don't learn what the Y is for the other individuals. And the sampling agent didn't observe this when they made the decision. We define x0 as a sampling threshold value so that individuals are selecting the sample only if x is larger than x0, and x is here normalized so that it's positively correlated to y, and x0 is always such that theta 0 of the population have an x value that exceeds x0. So this is the symptom threshold essentially for testing. And then quite often as the analyst we won't have access to x, we'll observe only theta and y, so it's useful to sometimes to express the observed sample average of y for everyone who's sampled in terms of a theta 0 threshold rather than the x0 threshold. So this would be the observed sample average for y for everyone who was sampled, given that that theta 0 of the population was sampled. Okay, so a few things about MDR TB prevalence in South Africa. Prior to 2011, which is the data that we're going to be using, guidelines indicated that persons at the highest risk should be tested. This included people with TB symptoms who had previously been treated for TB, patients who had failed TB treatment, those who were known contacts of MDR TB. But clinicians also observed other things like HIV status, whether they were at high risk of exposure due to their professions, whether they were drug users, past hospitalization, a range of things that the clinician could observe that maybe wasn't documented. And based on these things, clinicians then decided whom to test. Most of these factors aren't captured in the data, so they're not observed by the analyst. And these risk factors are known to be useful but imperfect predictors of MDR. So we think that fits the model that we just wrote down. Officially, the WHO estimate the MDR rate in South Africa at 2.5%, but it's based on what we perceive to be rather crude adjustments of notification rates that sort of acknowledge the sample selection basis, but not in a very explicit way. More reliable estimates are obtained from two surveillance studies where about 100,000 individuals were randomly selected and tested for MDR, 100,000 TB positive patients, but they are incredibly costly and therefore quite rare and performed on quite small sample sizes. In 2001, the MDR rate from this was 2.9%. The second study was recently released. It was done in 2012, and the estimate was 2.8%. But the confidence bands are very wide due to the small nature of the sample, so you can't statistically reject the hypothesis that 2.5% is the true rate. You need more precise estimates, and we think that's one of the things that our approach produces. Okay, so what can we say from data that we observed? The difficulty, of course, is that if you only observe a single observation of the sample average of y, then it's very difficult to know what that tells you about mu, right? So let's say 10% of the population was tested for MDR, and 50% test positive. That's a very high rate, but it's difficult to know whether that is indicative of a very high share of MDR prevalence amongst all TB patients, or whether it's indicative of the clinicians doing a very good job of using the information at their disposal to identify, even in a small sample, the high-risk individuals. Right, so what we're going to assume is that we observe not just one observation of the sample average, but that we observe this average over multiple subgroups, each of which has a different value of theta. So we'll refer to theta t as the sampling portion of the different subgroups, and we're going to be maintaining the assumption that the joint distribution of x and y is the same across these subgroups. Now, the first bit of information is if we observe that across these subgroups the sample average doesn't change with the sampling share, then that may be an indication of what's sometimes called haphazard sampling, right? So if the same share of people test positive for MDR, regardless of whether 1% or 10% or 70% of the population is tested, then maybe that means the clinicians are essentially randomly testing people who walk into their office, and then the non-changing sample average is probably a good estimate of mu, right? And that means, again, that seems to suggest that whatever the clinicians are using to select individuals from the sample doesn't seem to provide a lot of information. The other possibility is that the sample average decreases as the sample share increases, and in that case we can set to identify the value of mu, and I'll show you in a second what this means in practice. That basically means that the sampling agent is doing a good job, and in a very small selective sample, they find most of the Y individuals, and as the sample grows larger and larger, there's increasingly going to be some low Y individuals in the sample. So you'd expect the sample average of Y to decrease over larger samples. So the data that we're going to be using is from the National Health Laboratory Service database. We've got 85% of all suspected TB cases in the year between 2004 and 2010, 10 million test results, 5 million patients, restricted to people between the ages of 16 and 64, and then we restrict the sample to the slightly more than 2 million TB positive cases because they are our target population. And then we extract the number of patients tested for MDR and the number of patients diagnosed with MDR over the 27 quarters, which are the subgroups that we're going to be looking at. A few descriptive statistics, 22% of the suspected TB cases are TB positive. Those are the only ones that we're going to be looking at. From the sample of TB positive cases, 12% were tested for MDR on average over this period. 11% of these were tested positive. So that means that we have that 1.32% of all TB positive cases were shown to suffer from MDR. And maybe if we think that the clinicians do an incredible job of identifying high-risk individuals, then maybe 1.32% is a good estimate for mu. Certainly, it can't be any lower than 1.32%. The other extreme is that the clinicians are doing haphazard sampling, that they really just randomly test individuals, in which case the other polar extreme would be that 11% is the estimate of mu. And we can set to identify mu to be between 1.32 and 11%. Usefully, we observe different testing shares over this period of interest. So let me show you what that looks like. The orange line here shows you the proportion of TB positive patients who were tested for MDR between 2004 and 2011. And you see that it increases over time. There's a long run increase, but there's also some high frequency variation over time. And we see that this grey line represents the share of people who were tested who test positive. And there seems to be a negative correlation both over the long run and in the high frequency variation of the data. For example, in February of 2005, the first poster session was presented on XDR. And you can see over here how the South African authorities reacted to that by increasing the proportion of patients who were tested for MDR. And that sudden increase, which then dissipated over time, led to a decrease in the share of people who test positive. And then when the rate decreased, the proportion of people who test positive increased again. Exactly as you would expect if there was this selective sampling mechanism, because the more individuals who were tested by the clinicians who were selected for testing, the lower the expected value of Y. And we can leverage that information to try to come up with an estimate of mu. We also, when we compare the proportion of individuals who were tested to the proportion who were confirmed positive out of all TB patients, we see this positive correlation. So the more individuals who are tested, the more individuals show up being MDR positive, as you would expect, but the rate seems to be decreasing as we increase the testing proportion. All right, so set identification is one thing we can do, but in our case, the set is, the range of proportions are quite wide, so we need to be a little bit bolder in what we assume. So let's see which assumptions we can make. We can express the observed sample average as a function of some of the module distributions here. I'm going to restrict my attention to the simpler case where Y is binary, in which case this thing that we observe, the expected sampling share, is a function of the probability that someone with Y is equal to 1, in our case an MDR positive patient, will be included in the sample for a specific sampling proportion, and then mu, which is what we're interested in, theta t, which we can observe. And then basically what we need to do is we need to make an assumption about X, which we assume that the risk factors, the observable risk factors, are different on average for individuals who are MDR positive and MDR negative, and that gives us this function which we can use to estimate beta and mu. Basically, just a graphic depiction of what's going on. If we think that the distribution of symptoms for someone who's MDR positive and someone who's MDR negative are different on average, but at least partly random, then clearly, if you only test the most symptomatic patients, then a very high share of those are going to be ill. And as you decrease the symptom threshold, a higher share of healthy people are going to creep into the sample. And as the sampling share goes from 0 to 100%, the sample average is going to converge on mu. And essentially, we want to leverage different observed values of this curve to try to estimate what mu is. Okay, so I'm just going to run through some of the estimation. We assume that E, the stochastic element in driving the symptoms, is normally distributed. Because we don't observe X, we assume that beta 0 is equal to 0. And we're going to look at two different cases. We're first going to assume that mu is constant, so the MDR rate doesn't change over time. And then we're going to allow the MDR rate to be a smooth function of time. And then there's something a little bit, because the marginal density of X doesn't have a closed form solution, we need to either simulate or approximate the solution. So we use Gaussian quadrature with a Hermite polynomial of order 5, and then we use maximum likelihood or GMM to estimate mu, which is what we're interested in. And for the GMM, we either assume that the time effects are, that we use as the instrument either the time effects or specific policy changes that we know had an impact on the testing share. And when we do this, we get, when we assume that mu is constant, we get estimates across the maximum likelihood GMM with time IVs and GMM with policy IVs that are very similar, and in all cases suggest that the WHO estimate is substantially underestimating the extent of MDR in South Africa. There's just no way that if you use our sampling methodology that a mu of 2.5 could have produced the correlation between the testing share and the proportion of individuals who test positive. It's almost certainly higher than that, and this is quite close to the estimates that were produced by the surveillance studies, but much more precisely estimated because we use 2.2 million observations. When we allow for a time trend, we get relatively precisely estimated results that suggest that maybe there was this pattern of initially increasing MDR and then decreasing MDR. But and in all of these cases, the implied MDR rate is substantially higher than the WHO rates. We do some subgroup analysis, which finds that, the results are also similar to the surveillance study. When we look at repeat patients and people who are tested for the first time, we find a large discrepancy in the prevalence rates in exactly the same way as they do in the surveillance studies. And the last thing worth showing is if we simulate our model, then the predicted proportion of individuals who show up as confirmed positive cases are quite similar to what we observe. So the model seems to do a relatively good job of fitting the world in which we live. All right, and that's it. Thank you.
Can I go? Do I need to be introduced? Thanks, Rolf. Luckily, I also don't need to summarize it. I can only have to make comments. So firstly off, I think it's a really great paper, and you use an innovative statistical way of approaching data that's already available to answer questions that health policymakers obviously care about. I've got some comments about your identification assumption, and then I've got some policy comments as well. So first, about your identification, I get the idea that the two key assumptions here are that mu is constant over the population, and the second one is that the change in the threshold is exogenous. So I think we all know what goes wrong if the exogeneity of the threshold probably isn't random, but I'm more interested in if mu is not constant, are you still able to recover average treatment effects, or does your model not have an unbiased measure for still giving average treatment effects? Related to that question, you nicely at the end relaxed your assumption that mu is constant over time, but if mu is not constant across regions, could you have a similar approach in showing that areas, so if it was constant across regions, we'd expect regions who test more people to have lower MDR-TB rates, right? So it should be easily testable to see if it's a plausible assumption that it is constant across regions as well. Then with regards to policy, I think it's always tough to kind of have something that's very statistical and communicated with a health group, at least with applied policy-oriented health individuals. So I would perhaps suggest that you try and implement your model in a ROC framework where they've got curves that they love that compare sensitivity to specificity. And it's a lot like Lorentz curves when if you're testing at random, it's a curve down the diagonal, but if you're doing better than random, it goes to the top left corner and then comes back. And if people are good at picking up MDR-TB, when sending out the test, you'd see it further away and come closer in. A follow-up question. So I know you only use the threshold as a form of identification, but I think from a policy perspective, it would be really nice to phrase it in a way, and you already solved all the structural parameters in the model, so you could say how many people need to be tested at the current threshold to find one more MDR-TB person. And we know how much the current testing is much more expensive than a simpler test. We've got a price on a test, so you could calculate how much it costs to find the next MDR person, and then we can deliberate if we think it's too expensive or too cheap, but that might be helpful for policy and a novel way of pushing this forward. Thanks.
Let me briefly respond to those before we open up the floor to other questions. Thank you, Kobus. So the issue, so the question about mu being constant, I guess for this model, we think of the unit of observation as the whole country. So to some extent, mu is a single thing, right? But I suppose you're concerned about what happens if mu at the region or facility level is very different, and that induces variation in theta. So implicitly, what our toy model assumes is I guess that clinicians behave in a way that's sort of like they all get together and they rank individuals from the most to the least high risk, and that the correspondence between that ranking and the actual MDR-TB rate is the thing that's going to determine our response of the sample averages to changes in theta. So I guess if there's something going on that makes these clinicians do the ranking in a way that isn't optimal, I mean, I haven't tested this, but I think in the model that will just mean that it will seem like X is less informative than is actually the case. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but we do have data at the facility level. The reason why we not exploit that is mainly because given the kind of annoyingly complicated estimator, we try to really reduce the number of parameters to something that's manageable. So I mean, there's almost certainly more that we could do, but that we try to kind of not get too cute with how we implement the model. So theta being different across regions, I mean, I think that pertains to that as well. I take your point about kind of doing a better job of communicating this and maybe using ROC curves in a different framework. I think those are all good points. About the average treatment effect, so if theta is not exogenous, I guess the way that I think about the mu is not that it's an average of something. I do think that it's in some way related, I guess, to kind of Ekman and Wittlissel's story about marginal treatment effects. But I think what mu is essentially if you have an IV that kind of shocks everyone, if you could take the marginal treatment effect for everyone, I think that's what it's like an unconditional average, right? That's what the mu is, and I think if there's a correlation between theta and mu that's driven by other things, I think that would be problematic, but maybe problematic in a way that we can address, but that would be a concern. Okay, are there any other questions?
Hi, that was really interesting. A couple of questions, and I'm sorry I didn't keep up with the maths quite enough to know whether they're sensible questions or not. So one was a question about when you came to doing the estimation, where did those standard errors come from? Because you'd shown us through the identification and the point estimate, and my kind of intuitive suspicion is then carrying out the estimation kind of the standard way. What pops out with standard errors there is probably not what would correspond to the way you set everything up. So I was just wondering if you've done kind of analytically kind of explored that. And then I also had a question, it might not make any sense, but thinking about the kind of the risk factors that are observed to the people doing the test, but not to the person analysing the data, I was just wondering if when there are policy changes, they might start kind of picking up using different risk factors, which then changes the underlying joint distribution, and whether that might somehow impact on your identification.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. I think they're both good questions. So let me start with the policy changes. When we wrote this paper initially, there was a big change that occurred in 2011 where government switched to what they called the expert guidelines. They add this new technology, and we saw a rapid increase in the proportion of individuals who were tested, but also the new guidelines specified that way more people should be tested. And I think that led to a change in the way in which individuals were ranked, because essentially clinicians weren't supposed to be as careful in how they rank individuals. And that's the reason why we dropped expert those years is because of exactly the concerns that you expressed. I mean, I do think there are specific things that could have happened that could have changed how they behave, and that's part of the reason I didn't pay a lot of attention to this, but one of the estimates in the GMM framework is one in which the only variation in theta that we use is information that's due to policy shocks that led to a change in theta, but that we don't think led to a change in kind of more information, like the XDR scare that I referred to earlier. So you see a change in theta, but there were no corresponding changes in the guidelines. We don't think that the XDR scare had anything to do with sudden changes in South Africa. So that's a sudden change in theta that we don't think correspond to anything between how ill people were or how our clinicians did the ranking, and I guess the fact that those results are so similar to the results from the ones that make the stronger exogeneity assumption give us a little bit of peace of mind that maybe we're not getting that too wrong. With the standard errors, you're referring to the maximum likelihood in the GMM estimates. Is that right? So I mean, I'm not sure. I know how to answer that. So basically, I mean, I didn't state that I programmed the gradients and the ACNs myself, and it feeds at the ACNs, and at least for the GMM, the standard errors are clustered at the quarter level. So I mean, I guess they're always going to be approximate in some way, but I kind of assume that would be a decent approximation. I don't know whether that's if you have more information about why that's a bad idea. I'd be happy to hear that. I mean, maybe not now. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Afterwards, you can enlighten me. Are there any other questions?
Thank you. Just my question. X is not observable. I mean, X is not observable for the older populations, and you only have the data whose X is below some threshold, right? And then finally, when you estimate, then do you need a kind of distribution of the X in the population or not? Because I think that identification is based on the linearity assumption between X and Y, and then epsilon is kind of, error time is kind of normal, and then bucket out. So finally, do you need a distribution of the X, finally, to infer the population parameters?
So I don't think so. I think I mean it's a little bit tricky because there are some things that we observe that I think the clinicians probably would use as X, and we choose not to use it just to kind of simplify the model. But I mean I think apart from cases where X is very discrete and where there's essentially kind of a draw between 20% of the population, I think that's difficult for the model to handle. That's going to have implications that we haven't kind of explicitly written down. But I don't think it matters whether X is normally distributed or as some other kind of weird continuous distribution. I think as long as X is a thing that determines the ranking, and theta, which the analyst observes, determines what the X threshold is. I don't think that matters, except for the fact that sort of when we write down the model that we use to point estimate mu, we explicitly assume that E is normally distributed, right? So at the point where we make the stronger assumptions, at that point, maximum likelihood requires that we write down exactly what the distribution of E is. And GMM requires that it be orthogonal to kind of the instruments. So I guess from that perspective, I guess maximum likelihood does need that assumption. GMM doesn't, and the fact that they give similar results maybe means that it's not massively sensitive to the distribution assumptions of maximum likelihood of our maximum likelihood estimator.
Yeah, thank you. Because maybe some simple alternative is going to be like assume some distribution of the X and then estimate the kind of conditional expectation of the Y given X, and then just take the average, weighted average.
Okay, that's an interesting idea, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting.
So, yeah.
Cool. We have time for maybe one more question.
Probably it's a confusion question, clarification question more than a substantive question. I think at some point you mentioned that I think it was theta, which was exogenous to the sampling agent. Yeah. So I was trying to understand who is the sampling agent? Is it a clinician or is it someone else? Because if it is the clinician, then I'm wondering, if you are the one who's observing the patient, then how can that be exogenous?
So the way that we think about it is there are three agents. One is the analyst, and you don't get it. That's us sitting behind the laptop. We don't have anything to do with the data, with the sampling mechanism. There's the sampling agent who gets to decide who gets sampled, but doesn't get to determine theta. And theta is essentially the resource decision that's made by kind of central government. So the Department of Health decides this year we're going to allocate 10 billion rands to MDR testing. And that means we can test 8.7% of the population, and then the clinicians, they observe the resources and they decide who they want to test. They for each patient they get to go, yes, I want to test you. No, I don't want to test you, but they don't have any control over theta. That's a decision that's made in a different room, as well. That's kind of how we think about this. Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you very much for the audience, and thank you again for all the speakers. I think that was a very interesting session. Thank you.